The front door clicked shut. The new lock, a cold barrier between me and the $750,000 I'd spent. I stared at the wood. The key I'd carried for years now, a useless piece of jagged metal. Within an hour, the celebration for the brother, who'd earned nothing, would begin in the house I'd saved. They didn't just take my money and my home. They took my invitation, and that was their final mistake. There was a time when news like that would have hit me just as hard, and I still would have swallowed it, smiled and insisted I was fine. That reflex did not appear overnight. I grew up in a 2-story house on a quiet street in Rochester, New York, the one constant in every memory I had. It was not special to anyone else, but it was the backdrop to every birthday, every slammed door, every late-night talk. My father, Gregory Vance, tied his pride to that roof. He ran a small auto repair shop on the edge of town and liked seeing himself as the man who kept other families moving. At home, though, most of his attention flowed in one direction. My younger brother, Leo Vance, was the future he talked about, even when the future was just a worn-out house and a business that barely stayed afloat. My mother, Sarah Vance, moved between us, cooking, paying smaller bills, smoothing things over when tempers flared. With me, she assumed I would figure things out. With Leo, she assumed the world would make room for him. By my early teens, I had learned not to ask. If there was money for a school trip, it went to my brother. If there was a new jacket, he got it first. They just treated me like I did not need anything from them, and I adapted. My name is Julian Vance. I am 36, and I live in a small apartment not far from the house I grew up in. For 6 years, I poured almost every spare dollar I had into paying off one thing, the $750,000 mortgage on my parents' home. I always thought that when the last payment cleared, there would be this moment. Maybe a simple dinner? Maybe my dad saying he was proud of me for keeping the house out of the bank's hands. Instead, I got a phone call. He did not even bother with small talk. "I know you paid off the mortgage," my dad said. "All of it, but we are gifting the house to your brother as his graduation present." I remember staring at the wall, phone pressed to my ear, thinking I must have misheard him. Before I could say anything, he kept going. "And you are not invited to the party. I do not want you bringing your attitude into his big day." My mouth went dry. My brother had coasted through school while I worked double shifts to keep that house standing. And now I was the problem. I asked my dad if he was serious. He told me to stop making everything about money, said family should be happy for each other, then hung up. I just sat there listening to the dial tone until I finally turned to the only person who knew the truth about those payments and asked, "You want to tell them or should I?" 3 days later, my brother's big day did not look anything like a celebration. Before I tell you how everything fell apart at that party, do me a favor. If you have ever felt like the invisible one in your own family, hit the like button and subscribe to Fire Off Revenge so you do not miss the rest of this story. Your support helps more. People hear what really happens when the responsible child finally stops staying quiet. I studied, took whatever part-time work I could find, and focused on building a life that did not depend on my parents. When I left for college and then for work, that pattern hardened. I took whatever jobs I could get, then finally landed a position that paid enough to let me breathe. I rented small places, drove used cars, cooked at home, and told myself independence was worth more than any help my family might have offered. Back in Rochester, my father's shop started to struggle. Business slowed. One costly repair on his own equipment wiped out a month of profit. A bad winter pushed customers to delay anything that was not urgent. The mortgage slipped behind. Late fees stacked up. My parents never sat me down to explain, but the strain crept into their voices whenever I called. On one visit home, I opened the wrong drawer in the kitchen and found a thick stack of envelopes with the bank's logo across the top. None of them had been opened. Standing there with those letters in my hands, I understood how close they were to losing the only stable place we had ever had. I also knew how easy it would be to close the drawer, drive back to my apartment and let them face whatever came. Instead, I went to my old bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and did the math. I knew what I earned and what I could cut. It was obvious that if I poured a huge part of every paycheck into that loan, my own life would slow down. Promotions and raises would go into someone else's house instead of my savings. Trips and small luxuries would belong to other people. I chose it anyway. The payment started quietly. Every month, money left my account and chipped away at a balance that did not have my name at the top. My dad talked more about holding onto the family home framed as his determination, his sacrifice. My mom thanked me in small, private ways, a meal when I visited, a message saying she loved me, but she never pushed him to admit what I was really doing. When things grew especially shaky, a relative stepped in to make sure one bad year would not wipe out everything. My uncle Arthur Miller helped my parents sign a set of papers that tied the house and the loan to a more protected arrangement as long as the payments kept flowing. My name appeared in those pages linked to responsibilities I was already carrying and to rights I barely thought about. I told myself it was enough just knowing my parents could sleep, without wondering if a letter in the mailbox would take their house away. For a long time I believed that the days after, I started sending those large payments blurred into a narrow routine: work, bills, transfers, and then a small wave of relief whenever I saw the mortgage balance shrink. I kept telling myself that once the debt was gone, things between me and my parents would finally feel closer to respect than obligation. From my apartment, I watched Rochester move through its seasons. Snow turned to slush. The trees outside my window burned orange and red before going bare again. Each change outside matched another statement filed into a box under my bed, proof that I was still holding up a house I did not live in. On the weekends, I drove back to the old street. Nothing on the surface looked different. The siding still needed paint. The front steps still creaked. Inside, though, I felt the gap widening. My father talked more about how hard he was fighting to keep the place, how much he had sacrificed, how proud he was that the family home was still in our name. My role stayed unspoken, tucked into the same drawer where he kept the bank letters. When Leo's final year of college started, everything in that house tilted toward him. Phone calls revolved around his classes and his plans. My mother asked if I could come to his graduation because she wanted pictures with both of her children. My father planned a party and called it the fresh start the family needed. By then, the mortgage was almost gone. I knew how many payments were left and could already picture the moment when the last one cleared. In my head, it was simple. We would gather in the kitchen. My parents would open the letter from the bank, and the three of us would share the same understanding of what had been saved and who had saved it. I did not expect a speech. I did hope for honesty. The reality that followed felt nothing like that. There was no kitchen scene, no shared relief. There was only the bare fact that the loan was finally cleared, in the sense that my parents had been planning a celebration that did not include me in a house I had dragged back from the edge. The idea that something was deeply wrong settled in my chest. It would have been easy to tell myself I was overreacting, that I should be grateful they kept the house, no matter how they framed it. That was the story I had been repeating for years, but it sounded different now, like a script someone else had written for me. I pulled the folder with the trust documents out of my closet and read them properly. My name sat on those pages, tied not just to responsibility, but to future control of the property. The house was not some vague family heirloom. It was bound to agreements and conditions my father had accepted when he was desperate. That realization led me back to my uncle Arthur Miller. He had pushed my parents to protect the house when things were at their worst. The one person who insisted that if I was going to carry that burden, it needed to be recognized. Sitting across from him again, I understood he had always assumed I knew how much power those papers gave me. I left that meeting with a sharper picture than I had ever had. The house I had been paying for was not a prize my father could hand to my brother because it suited the story he wanted to tell. It was an asset anchored to my choices, my sacrifices, and my name. For the first time, I stopped planning how to keep the peace and started considering what it would mean to stop letting other people edit me out. Graduation weekend arrived feeling less like a milestone for Leo and more like a test of how completely I could be written out of my own work. That Friday night, I turned onto my parents' street and saw cars pressed along the curb, porch wrapped in string lights, a banner with my brother's name over the front door. From the outside, the house looked like a neat story about sacrifice paying off. Inside, the sound hit first. Relatives filled the rooms with paper plates and plastic cups. Conversations stacked on top of one another. A few hugged me in passing, surprised I had come, but their attention slid away almost immediately. Their questions and praise flowed toward my brother without slowing. As I moved along the edges, fragments of talk kept reaching me. People discussed where he might work, how he would set up his place, what he should do with the yard once he moved in. The house I had been funding, month after month, had already been recast as his starting point. No one questioned the premise. They were simply repeating the version my parents had offered them. My father drifted through the crowd, retelling a polished account of the last few years. In his story, he was the one who had held the family home together, the one who had pushed through lean months by sheer determination. My mother stayed close, topping off drinks, nodding at the right moments, keeping the focus where he wanted it. Neither of them mentioned the transfers that had cleared the debt. Across the room, my Uncle Arthur watched with a quiet steadiness. He knew exactly what the documents in our folder said about who had carried the mortgage and how the property was structured. Now he also knew my father had no intention of sharing that detail with anyone tonight. Eventually my father called everyone into the living room. People squeezed onto the couch and lined the walls. He stood by the old fireplace and talked about the house as the heart of the Vance family, about weathering hard years, about believing his son would carry things forward. Then he said the line I had been waiting to hear out loud. The home would serve as my brother's graduation gift, the foundation for his future. Hearing that declared in front of a room full of relatives turned the phone call into something heavier. It was not just a private insult anymore. It was an invitation for everyone present to agree that my part did not matter. Arthur stepped in before that version of the story could settle. In calm, plain language, he reminded my father that the house was not an heirloom that could change hands. With a toast, he mentioned the trust they had put in place when the bank letters piled up, the structure that existed, because someone else had taken on the payments. He did not use my name, but the connection was sharp enough that several eyes shifted toward me. The mood changed in small, noticeable ways. The applause my father seemed to expect never really arrived. People began slipping out earlier than they might have otherwise. He brushed off Arthur's reminder as a technical point, insisted everyone knew what he meant, and let the night wind down. I drove back to my apartment with a different kind of clarity. As long as I left my story in their hands, my work would stay in the background. If any line was going to be drawn, it would have to come from me. A few days later, I went back to the house alone. The banner and lights were gone. The street had settled back into its usual quiet. I climbed the front steps, slid my key into the lock, and felt it stop halfway. The mechanism had been changed. That small resistance said what no one in my family would say to my face. When the door opened, a narrow crack and my brother appeared with moving boxes behind him. He did not need to deliver a speech. The way he stayed half inside, the way his eyes flicked from my useless key to my expression, carried the message clearly enough. Whatever this place meant now, it did not include me. The door clicked shut. I stood on the porch with the key that no longer worked, and understood that my next move would not be another compromise. It would be the beginning of a boundary my family had never expected to see. The quiet after that locked door came home with me and refused to move. It did not feel like confusion anymore. It felt like a decision my family had made, and I was finally seeing it without excuses. The useless key sat in the middle of my coffee table. Now it was just metal, a reminder of how much of my life I had poured into a house I could not even walk into. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the porch, the new lock, my brother filling the doorway as if that space had always belonged to him. The warm story I had repeated to myself about doing the right thing, for my parents sounded thin and tired. In the morning, I pulled the storage box from under my bed and carried it to the kitchen table. I emptied it until the surface disappeared under paper. Statements, emails, copies of mortgage notices, all the proof that I had not imagined any of it. Each page marked a moment when I chose their stability over my own. I added the trust documents my uncle had pushed them to sign. I read them slowly, like a contract instead of a favor. My name was woven through the clauses, tied not just to responsibility, but to future control. The house was not simply a sentimental family symbol. It was linked in writing to the money I had already spent. For the first time, I treated the situation like work. I listed what I could not change and what I actually controlled. I could not make my parents fair. I could not make my brother grateful. I could decide where my money went and how my name appeared on anything tied to that property. That list led me to attorney Marcus Thorne. I brought the folders, set them on his desk, and laid out the sequence without softening it. He followed the paper trail instead of the family drama, pointing to sections that allowed me to block transfers, freeze attempts to move ownership around me, and insist that any formal decision about the house involve me. Hearing it framed in neutral language stripped away the last bit of doubt. I had been carrying. On paper, I was not an emotional son overreacting to a party. I was the person who had cleared a huge debt and the main beneficiary of the safeguards my parents had agreed to when they needed help. I called my cousin, Elena Miller, who worked with financial records and knew more about messy properties than she ever wanted to. She confirmed that my father had already started pushing the house toward my brother and had run into questions because of the trust. It was not confusion on his part. It was a calculated risk based on the belief that I would stay quiet. Later, I stopped by our old neighbor's place, Mrs. Gable's small house, right across from my parents'. She had watched our family long enough to notice when something serious shifted behind the polite version. She understood that official envelopes or unfamiliar cars might start appearing and that those details would matter. That night, I gathered the papers back into neat stacks, slid them into their folders, and put them on the shelf where I could reach them easily. They did not feel like old records anymore. They felt like tools. I was done waiting for my parents to suddenly decide to be fair. Whatever happened next would not depend on their goodwill. It would depend on how far I was willing to go to protect the part of this story that actually belonged to me. By the time my extended family gathered near the water for our usual summer cookout, the house had stopped feeling like a backdrop and Started feeling like a line someone was trying to push me behind. The park sat not far from Lake Ontario. Folding chairs circled the grills, kids ran between coolers, and relatives exchanged the same greetings they used every year. On the surface, it was just another Vance gathering. This time, almost every conversation bent toward my brother. People asked him about job interviews, apartments, plans for the next few years. The house appeared in those talks like a prize, waiting at the end of a game he had barely played. I listened as my father repeated the version he liked best. In that version, he had pushed through strain, kept the loan current through sheer will, and now had the satisfaction of seeing his son step into a secure future. When relatives asked how they had managed to hold on to the place, he talked about tightening belts, and my name did not fit anywhere in that narrative, so he left it out. My mother stayed close to him, refilling plates and adding small comments that reinforced the image. She talked about how excited she was to see Leo settle into the house, how it meant the home would stay in familiar hands. To anyone listening, it sounded like a simple, sentimental decision. The agreements and the years of payment stayed buried. I had not come empty-handed. A thin folder rested in my bag, the same one that had sat on my kitchen table while I sorted every statement and clause. I had no plan to wave it around, but I also had no intention of letting my father's story harden into fact, without any resistance. When a group of relatives sat down at one of the picnic tables, and the conversation slid toward the house again, I felt a choice appear. I could let the story pass, nod along, and watch the lie settle in, or I could introduce something that would not let it sit comfortably. I took out the folder, opened it to a page that carried my name beside the terms of the trust, and set it on the table. I watched eyes move from the paper to my father and then back to me. In that small circle, the idea that the house had been a simple gift began to dissolve. Questions followed, enough to disturb the smooth script my parents had prepared. Relatives who had assumed the story was straightforward started to realize there were pieces missing. My father tried to wave it off as legal fine print. My mother tried to steer the conversation back to lighter topics. The mood never quite returned to the warmth they wanted. The cookout went on, but something underneath it shifted. A few cousins pulled me aside later, and short messages appeared on my phone that evening. People who had accepted my father's version by default now understood there was more to it, even if they did not say so directly. A day or two later, my brother posted a short video. In it, he stood in front of the house, gesturing toward the porch and the windows as if unveiling a finished project. The caption framed it as the beginning of his life there, and a symbol of how proud our parents were. The comments poured in from friends and family, full of congratulations and plans to visit. Watching it from my apartment, I saw a public claim to a place that had already cost me more than most of them would ever know. My part in that story vanished with each reaction. I did not respond. I did not correct anyone. I closed the app, looked at the folders lined up on my shelf, and let the quiet in my apartment confirm that I was finished playing along. In the days before my brother's celebration, my schedule stayed the same, but my focus changed. I stopped hoping for a last-minute apology and started treating everything ahead of me as follow-through on decisions I had already made. The folders on my shelf were no longer background clutter. They were the boundary I intended to hold. On the morning of his big day, my cousin Elena confirmed that the filings Marcus prepared were live in every system that mattered. My years of payments, my name, and the trust my Uncle Arthur helped create were now recorded in places my parents could not rewrite with a story. For the first time, the version of events I had lived through stood next to theirs in something more permanent than memory. Later that morning, city officials walked up the front steps of the house I had funded, Mrs. Gable, watched them from across the street. My parents opened the door expecting early guests and instead received formal notice that the property was under review. The house could not be handed over as a simple gift while the trust existed, and a dispute was active. The people on the porch did not know anything about favoritism or family speeches. They saw a document, trail and obligations that could not be ignored. Mrs. Gable told me that my father's confidence slipped in a way she had never seen. For years, he had assumed his version of events was the only one that would ever matter. The envelopes left in his hallway said otherwise. Around midday, a tow truck arrived for Leo's car. The lease he had treated as a symbol of his smooth future was behind on payments, and there was no one left to quietly cover the shortfall. Early guests watched in awkward silence while the car was pulled off the driveway and taken away. For once, the cost of his choices landed where it belonged instead of rolling toward me. That afternoon, I drove back to the old street. Marcus met me with a slim stack of documents. My Uncle Arthur joined us with the folder that tied the house to the agreement he had insisted on when my parents were desperate. Walking up the path between them, I felt nervous, but I also felt finished. I was not there to ask for a place. I was there to enforce the one I already held. My parents answered the door with Leo behind them. Marcus laid out the present tense in calm, plain language. The trust would be enforced. The house could not be treated as my brother's personal gift while the dispute remained open. Any change in control would now require my consent. A short window was set for them to remove their belongings while a locksmith changed the locks. Where they went next would be their responsibility, not mine. In the weeks that followed, they adjusted to circumstances that finally matched their choices. My father and mother moved into a modest rental on the other side of town. My brother shared an apartment with people who judged him by what he did each day, not by promises my parents made about his potential. The house stayed where it had always been, but it no longer served as a prop in a story I was expected to applaud. I finished the repairs, met with Marcus and Arthur, and decided how to use the property by asking a question I had ignored for years. What would serve my life best? The answer was simple and practical. The house became an asset tied to my work and my name, not an altar to a version of family that only functioned if I stayed small. Once those decisions were in motion, I stepped back from the rest. Calls went unanswered. Messages that tried to paint me as cruel or ungrateful stayed unopened. I told relatives I was done standing trial in conversations where the verdict had already been written. The distance felt strange at first, but it was the most honest thing I had ever done with them. Looking back, the turning point was not a single notice or the sound of a tow truck. It was the moment I stopped, volunteering to disappear so everyone else could stay comfortable. Paying off that mortgage showed me how easily love can be used to excuse taking. Taking control of what I built showed me that love without respect is not a debt I owe to anyone, even if we share a roof or a last name. If there is anything I want someone listening to keep, it is this. Choosing yourself is not harm. Sometimes it is the first truthful thing you do for both your family and yourself.